we're going to be talking about design systems and accessibility, which is a topic dear to all of our hearts, but sometimes can be really struggling to know where to start with this topic. So we brought Daniel on board to talk about this as well. My name is Louis, and I'm a designer advocate at Figma, and I'm joined today by Daniel. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Henderson-Ede. My pronouns are he, him. I've got red hair, white male, in a really stripy shirt and a pair of glasses. I'm an accessibility designer at Pinterest, although today I'm coming at you as someone who just loves design systems, accessibility, and Figma. So I'm not here to represent Pinterest or the just design system, even though I know it's got a lot of fans out there. Today we're just going to be talking about, in general, accessibility and design systems.
Nice, welcome. And on deck for today, we have a few key topics, which we're going to try and go through at speed, probably. We don't have too much time. But we're going to be having a discussion about careers in design systems and accessibility in particular, the challenges of trying to build accessible design systems, and the industry, where we think it is, where we think it should go. Then Daniel's going to do a live component annotation using an annotation kit, which we'll talk about shortly. So that's a little mini demo that we'll get going. And then there's plenty of time for audience Q&A. So as I mentioned, please get your questions into the chat as well. But first, let's look at some resources. Daniel, over to you.
Cool. So we're talking about annotations, and I thought this would be a great time to talk about some annotation tools and kits that are out there. Today, we're going to be using the Web Accessibility Annotations Kit built by CBS Help. And full disclosure, I was part of the team who built this, which is why it's one of my favorites. But there's other ones out there that are also great to use. Indeed built a great kit. It's one of the first ones. Intopia and GitLab have also done similar things. eBay brought out a tool last year. There's actually more of a plugin that does similar annotations. So there's so many things out there. I wanted to highlight some of the great work the accessibility community has put together over the years.
Great. And we're going to be doing the demo later via the simple design system, which was built in-house by Figma. So that's why we've linked that one in the file. And there's some other resources over on the right-hand side of this slide too. So there's generally the W3C guidelines, to the WCAG guidelines. Go and have a look at that, go and read it, go and consume it. It's lengthy, but I promise you it's worth the investment. If you're building for the web, go and check out the Chrome for Developers Accessibility Reference Guide with the URL on the screen. If you're building for iOS, there's the voiceover commands, which I'd encourage you to read the documentation for as well. If you're building for Android, there's the talkback feature. So go and have a look at that documentation too. And the GitHub plugin that we mentioned in the bottom right of the slide is something that is used internally at Figma. So if you're building React apps, go and check out the ESLint plugin for JSX accessibility. And lastly, there is a Foundations course from W3C as well. So go and check those resources out. Before that, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. I'm going to pull down the screen share, and I'm going to have some questions that we preceded for Daniel. So Daniel, firstly, it would be great for us all to learn a little bit more about how you got into accessibility as maybe a designer or an engineer or a design systems person, or however you frame that.
Sure. So I never imagined being in accessibility. I went to school to be a software engineer. I thought I wanted to build websites. That was going to be my life. And it kind of is that. But I've specialized in accessibility, and it's been a gradual thing that's come over the years with various roles and my own personal learnings. I started off at the UK government, and as many of you know, so I got terrible speech sometimes. We have accessibility is really important in government because we're trying to serve all citizens there, and so I really started to get involved in what is WCAG. And I remember the first time opening up that document and having like a heart attack, like, what is this thing? It looks like a monster, right? And over the years, I've kind of tamed that monster and understood what it means. And as I slowly moved towards design, as someone who thought they loved engineering, I started to realize I didn't really like it so much, because if anyone's ever run npm install on their machine and you get a bunch of errors, that's something that I did not find enjoyable, was fixing other people's errors and not understanding how it worked. And so I moved more into design and thinking more about the users and the humans who are going to be creating this stuff. And I realized as an engineer, I was making garbage websites for those people. Right? Even though I thought it was great, the actual experience was terrible. So I went to get my UX certification and learned all about the design aspect. But I always tell my wife I don't think I'm always fully happy, and that's something that I've personally trying to work on. But that's where accessibility actually came a spark to me, because I missed engineering and I personally missed design. And accessibility, I always say, is kind of the baby of both disciplines. You have to really understand design and you have to really understand engineering to make something successful. You have to understand the human at the end who's going to be using it, the disability that they may have, any technology they may be using, and then how the code is built. And without knowing all 4 steps, something falls apart along the way. And so with all my kind of knowledge over the years and those experiences, found myself doing accessibility full time. For me, it's an exciting challenge. I don't myself, when I first got into it, I wasn't disabled. And so I didn't really have anyone close by to me who was disabled. So it didn't really come from a personal like motivation to do it. My real motivation was I really loved the challenge. It made me a better designer and it made me a better engineer. And that's something I think that we can all relate to. We all want to do what's best for our users. And I would like to see some more of you come away with that idea of we can be better for our users and for ourselves.
But do you think that it wasn't necessarily that you became or went from engineer to designer to design systems professional to accessibility expert? It was just something that you felt was a requirement, regardless of which of your output it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was definitely highly encouraged when I became an engineer that accessibility is important when I was at the government. So I was introduced the same way many of you have been introduced, where someone's told you it's important and you're trying to go, is it? And you kind of start to ask those questions, and you start to answer those, and you understand, oh, it really is important, and all the gaps that we're creating for people with disabilities. And that's how I really understood it myself.
And for somebody that is either in design position, engineering position, that is very aware that they need to be paying more attention to the accessibility standard of the work they're producing, what's the sort of first thing they can start to do?
If you're already extremely aware of the needs and have some ideas of how you would go about them, the first thing you do is just do them, right? Don't wait for some organizational mandate to say, we need to conform to WCAG 2.1 or 2.2, whatever it may be. Don't wait for that. Go ahead and do it. You don't wait for someone to tell you to make usable designs or to make secure and efficient engineering code, right? You don't wait for that. You do it because that's your job.
So as a foundational requirement, we need to be brushing up on these standards to know the minimum that it should be, regardless of whether it looks nice in a certain style or not. There is a standard and a foundation that we absolutely have to be meeting as designers and engineers.
Yeah, the WCAG is often looked upon as the golden, like, top of the hill, like, let's aim for that. But what you'll often hear people who work in accessibility is that's actually the base camp, right? It's the minimum requirements for an accessible experience on either a web or a mobile device. And without those, we're going to be giving blockers to people who need access to our services. And so you need to understand WCAG, not really necessarily what the success criteria are. You need to understand the user needs that are baked into it, right? If someone is blind, right, what do they use to access your website? If someone has color blindness, right? What sort of things can we do to improve our colors on our system so they're not left out with any medium we use with color? That's the important stuff you need to understand. And you'll go, as you do that, as you focus more on those user needs, you'll realize you're going well beyond WCAG minimum requirements, and what you're just making is good software.
Mm-hmm. And for the people who do have really good intentions, but are finding it hard to, I don't know, find the time or convince stakeholders of a senior leadership level that they need to make more time to improve the standards of their software, their app, their website, whatever it is, what should they do? How should they tackle the problem of we can't get sign off to spend more time on this as a project or as a standard?
Yeah. That's an age-old question that people who have been doing accessibility for a long time always struggle to answer is, what do we do when we don't get leadership buy-in? And my personal take is design systems are an answer to so many issues in the accessibility world. Like, how do we do it? How do we do accessibility consistently? How do we teach people about best practices in accessibility for an organization? And using your design system is usually a great place to start, because they often, a design system, start as a community effort, right? It's a few folks in the organization who want to create this component library, and that kind of empowerment that's already there is a great place to start building those things in. Can you add it to your documentation? Can you make sure you add some specific roles that are implicit to all components? And then as organizations mature, they and the design system matures, they tend to say, hey, I want some sort of like federated model. I want every team to start submitting components. And then again, that invitation is there to make the design system more accessible. And you can then add more guidelines, or add new components, update components. That invitation seems to be always there in the design system world. So use it to make your product more accessible, but then all the other products in your organization that are consuming it too.
When we start to think about the challenges of building more accessible products, there's tons. It might be collaboration aspect. It might be the tools you have access or don't have access to test. It might be that you might have a metrics driven project to improve accessibility by X%, or improve a revenue target by X dollars, or you might have to have a larger business impact via this project that you want to embark on. So with all these challenges in mind, let's take collaboration as the first one. You're a designer or you're an engineer. You have these goals of building more accessible products as a unit, but you can't get that collaboration to bubble away. What advice would you have for a team that's maybe struggling in that respect?
One of the biggest breakdowns between collaboration between designers and engineers is not understanding each other's language. And I don't mean like computer language, right? Because the designers don't have a computer language, but we actually do have ways that we talk about our products. We talk about blurs as a designer, or like corner radiuses. That's something that's talked about. Engineers are always talking about elements and roles and things. It's really important to understand what the other person is looking at in their day-to-day job, especially as we're doing more remote or hybrid work, and we're not sitting next to each other as much as we probably once were. Having those conversations and being able to almost preemptively give them the information that they need is really important, and understanding what your platform can support. You'll often hear a lot of design folks talk about the web and the M-web, right? But that is a misconception of what the web is. In the early 2000s, we did have the M-web, right? We had m.figma.com, right? If Figma was around back then, because we a separate website. But now we have one code base. And so like that, again, is if you start to change and understand your platform as a designer and how your engineer is working, you can have better conversations about, hey, how does responsive design work? How do we want this to behave at different breakpoints? Or if you're, trying to talk about even more advanced work like a grid, where you're starting to let the browser take control of your website and how it's displayed. And so the collaboration is really down to not understanding what the other person really needs, and so talk to your engineer or designer, whatever side you're on, and ask them what they need, right? And you will learn from there.
I think a hard thing for specifically when we're looking at a designer lens is not understanding the estimation size of an idea that you have. Designing something and I want it to look or feel a specific way, I can mock that up in Figma pretty quick. But it might require an enormous amount of engineering effort to get that across the line. The obvious answer is talk more often, but that is unfortunately not a reality for a lot of remotely distributed teams. So how do you personally manage ideation to sort of reality in terms of building more, I guess, simpler or more accessible products, or just getting ideas across the line?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge for sure, and it's not something that I don't think anybody has solved. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But this split between here's a designer and here's an engineer, we have to get rid of that. Like, yes, designers are going to be in Figma creating designs. But whenever you can, bring your engineer into those conversations. Don't wait until you've designed something and show them it, right? If you're able to bring that engineer in and iterate with them, and the best engineers that I've worked with have some design knowledge, right? And they want to give you input, like, oh, the best way to upload a file is like this, right? That's a very technical challenge, uploading a file, and there's only certain ways you can do it. Get them in the room for things like that to talk about what is commonly done and the most efficient ways of doing it. And that's really the only way to break down those barriers, I think.
And we mentioned a classic question earlier, but another classic question is return on investment or monetary value of investing in building more accessible products. And I presume the answer might be, tell me if I'm wrong, it's what the impact of not doing it is. I know we see many court cases come up of companies that see the wrong end of not investing in accessible products. So what is your advice for that leader that comes to you and says, I need a business case for this?
Yeah, there's two big business cases. One is the kind of the compliance side for any legislation that may exist to where you serve. Right, and so there is the two big ones that I've thought about is the Americans with Disability Act in the US and the upcoming the European Accessibility Act in the EU. Those are both extremely important because someone could sue you because you as a company haven't done your job to make an equitable experience, and they can cost upwards of millions, minimums of tens of thousands, even just to represent yourself in court. Right, so those numbers add up quickly, and along with the monetary value, there's then obviously bad brand reputation that will come out of it because the accessibility community and people in the disability community, they talk to each other, right? Just like anyone talks to anybody. You recommend products to somebody, and if something is not accessible or is not usable or doesn't look good, whatever is important to you may be, you're going to recommend it to the same people in your group. And so it's more than just the dollar value you spend at the end. It's all the things that go down. And if someone doesn't like your product, right, they're probably going to go to a competitor's product. So not only have you lost dollars, but you've given your competitor more dollars, right? And so it's like a double penalty there. But on the flip side of the business case, it isn't just the money you're going to lose. It's the money that you've not even tried to get, right? From a business standpoint, there is 1 in 5 people have a disability worldwide, and that number changes slightly depending on how you define what a disability is and if it was disclosed or whether someone has said that person is disabled. But we're talking about 1 in 5 people. When you scale that up to the population of the world, right? One of my favorite stats is that is a market bigger than China, right? And when you put it that way, it's like, whoa, okay, like if you're selling a product, you wouldn't purposely go, I don't want anyone from China to buy it, right? Because that, from a business standpoint, makes 0 sense. The same way you wouldn't go. And so when it comes to people with disabilities, it makes no business sense to say, I'm going to ignore all these people, because the amount of money it costs to make something accessible is far less than the amount of money that you will gain with those additional customers.
And then when we start thinking about the industry in a sort of wider sense, what's your feeling about the state of where we are with accessible products, apps, businesses, design more generally? And you can take the industry as narrow or wide as you want.
I'll start with the positives for sure. Like the design system space is probably been one of the most positive areas in terms of advocating for accessibility and considering people with disabilities and their needs. We are, you often see posts on LinkedIn. There's so many conference talks about accessibility, and often it's sharing resources. You think about the top design systems out there, right? They're usually the design systems with the better accessibility, like Github UK. There's the US design system. There's I can't even think of all from head. Carbon. There's a bunch of others out there that we are constantly reference, and they have great considerations for accessibility. So I think that's a really positive aspect. I think what's from a bad standpoint in the design system world, I think we rely too much. I won't say too much. We oversell the design system's capability when it comes to accessibility, Like we sometimes you get people who are consuming the design system that assume, hey, if I use the design system, then I have no issues whatsoever, right? And that's just not the case. That is a misunderstanding of what a system is. You have your building blocks, but you still add the content. You still put it on the page. You still have a reason for that thing existing. You choose which component you want to use. Or those are opportunities where you turn what was an accessible component into an end experience that is not good for some people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think also, yeah, the system isn't the be all and end all of all your problems, although it can solve a lot of things. And I think as you was talking, it kind of reassured me that, yeah, the system isn't just like something over there that is fixing everything. It's part of the whole cohesive whole of the output of the business. Should we maybe jump over to the live demo and build some components and annotate them up?
That sounds lovely. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know when you can see it, Louis.
Yep, perfect.
Lovely. So I am in actually a design file right now. So this is, we're simulating, I'm a UX designer designing a new flow, and I'm consuming the system. And in this case is the simple design system. I have a dialogue component here. I'm going to hide my zoomed in here. And then I've got my dialogue component here, and I've added a title that says, would you like to upgrade? And I've got some body copy about releasing version 3.0 of the simple design system. Would you like to update? And then two buttons at the bottom, one that says view planned updates and another that says update to version 3.0. All right, so we've consumed the dialogue and we've added our content for the experience we're trying to build. Now, I could just give this to an engineer and go, have at it, right? But what's interesting is if you think about what if we didn't have a design system at this point, right? Whether if I made this component from scratch, there's a lot of questions here that an engineer would have when they were building it. And that engineer is going to do two things, right? They're either going to ask you what this thing should be, or they are going to assume and just do it for you, right? Both are equally correct answers, and I understand both of them completely. But what the problem is with that latter one, where the engineer assumes and makes a decision for you, is that is going to affect the experience, right? And as a designer, you should care very much so about the experience, whether or not it's visual or not, doesn't matter, right? You should own the experience, the audible experience, the visual experience, the search engine experience, all the different experiences that someone goes through, you should care about in some degree. And so a great example here is this close button we have on the Modal. Now, it is an icon-only button, right? Which means it needs to have an accessible name or a label, right? So if someone using a screen reader, they can go through the focus and it will read out something like button close. Or if you're using voice control, you can say tap close, right? Those things don't get there by accident, right? Someone on the engineering side has to type in a way to implement that. You as a designer then should care what the name of that thing is, because you understand the context of the experience. Now, in this case, close is a pretty familiar thing, right? And the engineer could just assume it is close, and it would probably work out okay. But you think about more complicated buttons and icon buttons we have, where there's a question mark button. Does that mean help? Does that mean contact us? We have all these, if you have some customized like a like button on Facebook, that before we knew that was a like button, someone had to define what like was, right? We've now established that pattern, but that conversation between the designer and engineer had to happen. Same with this, would you like to upgrade? We have a heading, right? It's saying this is a section and all the things that you would like to add. And this could be a heading 1 or a heading 2. It doesn't particularly matter in some regards, but it's good to have that conversation, because what you're really saying, if it's a heading 1, this is a new topic, right? This is unrelated to the page that you're just on. But if you're saying it's a H2, you're saying this is related to the heading 1 that was on the page behind it. And that relationship is really important, especially for people who can't visually perceive it, because they need to have that programmatic relationship built in, so they can their technology can read it out, or it can print it out on a braille display, so they know what that relationship is. Now, what we can do is start to annotate things, and this is just a solution to the kind of the collaboration problem that Louis and I were talking about earlier. There's many other ways to do it. Annotations is just one way that has become kind of common across the industry, because it provides documentation for what you want this component to do, but also a kind of it's almost a framework for discussion, right? If you have these different items to think about, it's easy to forget some of them. I totally get it. I forget stuff all the time, right? And so having that framework is really helpful to have those discussions. So I can say, there's I'm in the one thing here. I'm going to open up the Web Accessibility Annotations kit, and there are 7 or 8 different types of elements. And for the web, there's pretty much everything is built out of these kind of 8 things in some way or another. And so I have a button area. And so here we have a button stamp. So I can pull out this button stamp onto my page and change its direction here and say, hey, engineer, this thing here is a button. I'm going to turn off. I'm going to hold down my space bar so it doesn't get clipped in. So here, engineer, this is a button. It's not going to take you somewhere, right? If you think about these view planned updates or update to version 3.0, view planned updates, I'm not quite sure whether or not that's a link or a button, and it's important to tell your engineer, hey, I either want this to do something or I want it to go somewhere, right? And that's a really important distinction to help your engineer know the flow of your experience. And then with this button here, I can say, okay, engineer, let's give this a good name, right? That our users are going to know. I know my users really well. I'm going to tell you what I think. Then I want you to see it, and I want you to tell me what you think. Right? And so I'm going to pull out my buttons details component, and this goes hand in hand with it, and say each annotation kit does this differently. It's more the concept of annotating your design, and you can even use the Figma annotations feature. It doesn't really matter how you do it. It's just a way to help provide that communication framework. And so I have this button here. I'm going to turn on its number to kind of create this link between this button here is directed to this button's details. And I can say, this has an accessible name, and I want the accessible name to be close. Right, and now you have in documentation for this design. I want this to be closed. The engineer can see this and go, yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I'm gonna put that in. It gives an opportunity to go, oh, actually, I probably do it this way. Because then we want the designer, the engineer, to also have an opinion on this, because they have a good idea of how technology works, right? And so having that backwards and forth is really helpful. Lou, I'm going to jump into the design system side. We don't have any questions at this point before we do that.
I think we could talk for a long time about the icon actually being a button. And something that is something you don't necessarily think about immediately as a designer who hasn't had to go through that process. But things like touch target size and states and interactivity lead you to the point where you automatically went, this is the button. But somebody who hasn't been through that maybe hasn't considered that yet.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a very good point. It's I do make quite a few assumptions because I've been doing this for a while, and so this is again, it's okay to not to make these mistakes. Like if you're not doing this, and I kind of mentioned at the start, I started off as an engineer who didn't really know anything about accessibility, right? And so as you go along your journey as a designer and trying to take more consideration into this, you will make mistakes, and that is totally okay. No one is expecting perfection. What's important is, like, in your heart, in your motivation, is you are thinking about those people and those needs, right? And as long as you're doing that, you will be doing the right thing, and you will get better and better as you go along. So it's always something just to keep in mind. Well, don't be scared. Just try it, right? And if it's not quite right, someone else on the team will work with you, and hopefully you'll get in the right direction. So just keep that in mind all the time.
Yeah. Can we maybe jump onto the markup of the title here? How would you mark that up? What DOM element would you map it to? And maybe look at how you structure that.
Sure. So one of the things in this annotation kit is a heading stamp. And so this is where in HTML, if you're not unaware, there is different elements for headings. There's H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, right? And they're really important for people using screen readers to quickly navigate different sections of the page and understand when they get to a page. Often they'll open up their rotor or a kind of accessibility menu. And it will tell them all the headings on the page. It won't give them any other content. It will just say, here are the different headings on the page. That's really helpful, especially when not so much in a modal, but on a long page with different headings to understand that context. But what I can do here is I can say to the engineer, hey, I want this to be a H2, and just simply drag on my annotation and say, hey engineer, I want this to be a heading. This is a summary of the content below it, right? Would you like to upgrade? That is a key heading. You don't even, if you're not sure if it should be a H1, H2, H3, I should just say, I'm going to just hide this element here and just say, hey, engineer, I want this to be a heading. I don't know where it falls in the rest of the hierarchy, but I know this is really important to call out. And again, that is a step above what you were doing before, which may have just been leaving this blank and hoping the engineer identifies the headings for you. So that's really helpful. What, Donnery?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and then how would you start to think about keyboard navigation of something like a dialogue or a modal, which is a pretty common pattern?
Yeah, this is why I actually picked dialogue or modal, whatever you want to call it, because actually it's something that has kind of changed recently in the way it behaves. So up until about a year or two ago, whenever an engineer built a dialogue, they were building it from scratch. They were popping up a box, and they were making sure the focus behind it was disabled, and they were making sure that the focus when you were inside the modal went around when you got to the end of the final button back to the start, so it didn't go somewhere else, right? But it recently, I won't say recently, last one, I say one or 2 years, the HTML spec has rolled out and the browsers have rolled out the dialogue element, right? And so we actually have for the first time an actual element in HTML that supports dialogue. And so the focus behavior on that has changed. It's rather than, because before we were kind of doing a custom thing and we were doing what we could to make it accessible, now the new HTML dialogue element focus, when you get to the end of the modal, it goes back up to your browser Chrome. I learned that Chrome is the name of the basically the browser menus and stuff, like the actual interface. I never knew that was its name until recently. But that's a good conversation to have, because if you're kind of expecting it to kind of do the old way, or maybe the custom way of doing a dialogue, you're going to be confused how focus is going to work and how screen reader and someone using a keyboard is going to go through it. But you have that conversation with the engineer, you can start to say, hey, we want this new the HTML dialogue element to do it, and how focus behaves could actually change from browser to browser, right? Safari may do one thing, Firefox may do one thing, Chrome may do one thing. It happens a lot on the web, especially if you look at inputs, right? They're all sounding kind of slightly different. And that is completely okay. Designers like to have everything be consistent across each browsers. I'd love to stop that kind of philosophy of making sure every single experience is the same, right? Because if you do that, think about Jacob's law, right? If people stick to one browser, right? I'm diehard Safari personally, right? And if something doesn't behave like Safari, right, it's going to throw me off because I'm every day in Safari. So let Safari do what Safari wants to do, or let Chrome do what it wants to do. And that's really kind of the exciting part about this conversation, is you can say, are we making a custom behavior? Or are we letting the browser do what it wants to do?
So for things, so you mentioned that we're getting better with sort of the native implementation of the keyboard navigation of something like a dialogue. As a designer, and you're starting to think about tab order of an element, how would you start to document that?
So I don't like to document tab order unless it's unclear, right? Because in this respect, in this aspect, I can make a quite clear assumption from the way that it's built out is it's going to go to the close button first, the view planned updates button, and then the updates to version 3.0 button. Because when you build a website, and the document object model is basically the way the page is built, and it goes from top to bottom, right? And so tab order works exactly the same way. It just kind of reads the way the code is being built. And so as long as the engineer builds this in a way that looks like the design, we're not going to worry about it. But if we have some, let's say we're doing custom tab order because we're using a non-HTML element, this is where you can start to, we have, how is it? I can't even see it. Read an order, a focus order, here it is. Focus order, you could start to add details about focus order. This is good time to add. You can say, I want this to focus to, let's see, what's the word? Focus to go to first element from last element. That's not great writing, but you get the idea. And that way you can start to have those discussions again and talk about it with your engineer.
And then when we layer on the complexity of, let's say you've annotated this entire component, it could get a little busy. Would you slice that component up into different levels of annotation, or would you just keep it as busy as it possibly is?
So here's the fun part about design systems. Pretty much all what we talked about is redundant, right? We didn't need to do any of this because we have a design system, design in Figma, and we most likely have a code counterpart which the engineer is going to use to implement it. So if you think about this here, right, this close button is probably standard for our modal, right? And so there is no need for me as a designer or the engineer to have this conversation, what should this be called? Because the component probably already has it in there, right? And so we can delete this. Same with the heading. We probably don't need to talk about what heading this needs to be because it's probably already in the components. So we can delete that. Oh, there we go. Same with the focus order. It's probably already built in. And so we're going from this heavy annotation and talking about every single component, every single design decision, to using our design system to not have to talk about every single little detail and let it do a lot of the work. Now you still have to consider like this, the kind of the body of the modal, because I wrote this text, I added these buttons, right? And so this is again where we kind of talked about at the start. It doesn't do everything for you. It does the stuff that is repeatable between use cases. And so, hold on, Louis.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, at the point of it getting built, that is the which should document that decision. Are you suggesting that that is handled specifically in the context of the system, or that we should be documenting or annotating these things in design files to be built to?
So what I found works best is in your design system. So I've switched over to the simple design system library here. This is a great place to annotate your component when you're building it. So I can pull over here these this section, which is a few examples of how the component is being used. So we have our what would you like to upgrade again. That's actually an example that's being used in the system. But you could, in theory, take a copy of the default component and say, let's annotate this for an engineer who is building the component, right? This is where I want to say, again, to the engineer that for every single instance of this component, I want this button to have, let me close this off and share the local components. Every single instance of this component, I want to have a label of close, right? And so now you've documented in your system that this button is always going to be a close button labeled, right? The engineer knows. You can have that conversation with the engineer building the component. Should it be, what we just talked about? Should it be closed? Should it be something else? Can we standardize it? Is there enough standardization in this component to know it's always going to be called close, or could it mean something else depending on if it's used in a certain way, right? And now you have that. And I've been working on design systems for a while, and I've annotated a bunch of components and built a bunch of components. Someone can ask me, hey, what happens to this component a year later, and I've completely forgotten how this component is built. Right? Even though I did every single thing, I was there the entire way. I raised the component, I birthed the component, and I don't know, right? Because there's so many things going on in little details. You can come back to your design system documents, whether it's in Figma, whether you've got it on your documentation site, and see, okay, these are the things that are standardized. And as people move on and people come in and out and things change, that stuff is already always there. And you don't have to have someone look at your code and try and interpret the code, because no one likes to do that. It's harder for everybody, including engineers. This is much clearer to understand.
And this workflow does take time. And as somebody who is technical in nature, this might feel like it's just sort of second nature to you. There's somebody who maybe isn't that way inclined and is working at pace. Is your advice here that sort of every single designer in every feature file should be annotating their designs? Or is it that this is a systems only event?
I believe that all systems should be doing annotations, that's for sure. I think it's really important to document the accessibility expectations. And there's more than just accessibility that you have to annotate. I mean, if you look at what you've got up here, we have kind of a few annotations using the Figma annotations tool to talk about what certain things are. So it's not specific to accessibility. Designers have been annotating for years, right? But I do think it's also really important for designers who are consuming components in product teams to annotate things where it's important to do so, right? Where you need to have a conversation with the engineer. I know a text input, I think, is one of the best examples on the web, where there's lots of design decisions you have to make that aren't visual, right? And a prime example is the virtual keyboard on touchscreen devices, right? That's really important for every single person who enters that input. And if you've not thought about, as a designer, whether I want it to be a numpad, a keypad, and A to Z, whatever it may be, you're relying on your designer, your engineer, to kind of assume, or if you're lucky, they'll ask you. But I think it's important at your stage as a designer to think about, okay, I can actually use an annotation here to say, hey, this input right here, and there's actually an annotation in this kit for something similar like this. Here we go. This input right here, I want it to have an input mode of numeric, right, which is the virtual keyboard. It's the attribute that's used as virtual keyboards. And kind of here as a designer, I've started to use the engineer's language, because that's kind of being standardized. You could just say virtual keyboard equals number, right? That's plain language, and your engineer was most likely going to understand that because it makes complete sense, right? So I think it's important to think about those non-visual decisions as a designer, and where you can, where you understand them, and talk to your engineer about them, and try and annotate them both in the design system and in your product.
Mm-hmm. And back to the button for a moment. Let's say that we had a scenario where in one instance, the icon button with a close icon is close, labeled close, and another is labeled skip. How would you approach that?
So in one design, it's called close, in one design, it's called skip.
Yeah, but the same component, same icon button, same X icon inside.
So this is where your component annotations are really important, because what we're essentially saying here to anyone who consumes this as components is, don't you dare re-annotate this, right? This is already built into the system. If you try and add an annotation back into my design file for this close button, you would confuse the heck out of your engineer, because what they're going to try and do is break the component, because they want to say, I want this close button to be skip, right, or whatever it may be. If that's the case, we're starting to undermine our design systems' kind of structure and reliability and consistency. And so, as a designer, you make sure you use you understand your components. And what one of my mentors always said to me is, when you're choosing a component, it's not about what the component looks like, it's what about the component is, right? And that's a really important distinction to make as a designer. What is the purpose of this component? And in this case, it's to give you a message and close that message. If you want to skip something, this component doesn't seem right for you.
Nice. I might just take over the screen share and ask a few questions from the audience. We have about 9 minutes, so we might have to act fast, but we'll see how far we can go. Okay, first question is, when designing, I typically focus on the ideal state, but often overlook other scenarios like empty states, logged in out states, errors, etc. How do you ensure all these scenarios are addressed in a design system? What strategies or tools help you avoid missing these?
Yeah, I think that's gotten harder, especially as Figma's become more advanced and it started to add like component properties where it's so fancy that you don't even see all the different states anymore with the different different variations of a component you may have. And so what I've really started to kind of embrace having more documentation in the Figma file. And the simple design system is a great example of kind of an overview of that, is pull out each instance of your components and show the error state, show the login state, show whatever state it has, right? And annotate them there. Or whatever, annotate, talk about them, give examples. And you can add them to your documentation site. It doesn't depend on how your system works and what people look at regularly and work to your people. But
I found it useful as well when more on the sort of feature design file side is to start with those states. So every flow, make sure that the starting one is the loading, the second one is the no content, the third one is the error state, and then go to the happy path after. So you know you've always got those at the front. All right, next question. We produce native apps and are getting pushback from engineers because a lot of the requirements show examples relating to the web. Where this happens, is it a case of following the same principles and applying those to an app or not?
I'm a big believer of kind of a platform first design, right? Which is stick to what your platform does. The best way to do that is rather than trying to take your website and convert it to an app, you will notice any app that you use that has tried to do that because it won't feel right. And you may not identify what it is, but it doesn't feel like a native app. And you'll see Apple's App Store is very different to their website store because they've dived into what the user expects and thinking about Jacob's law, right? The user spends most times on other websites or other apps. So as soon as they come to yours on their platform, whether it's an iOS device, Android device, certain browser, they want it to work how they've worked everywhere else.
Yeah, and you'll find that iOS or Android documentation has their own definitions of certain aspects. For example, touch size is different in CSS than it is to an iOS app. So you might be better off sort of blending or merging some of these concepts based off what the expectations of the platform is versus what the standards are that you know are sort of global.
Yeah, and in each assistive technology on each platform works differently, which is an important part. Like on Android and iOS, you can actually group elements within a focus, whereas on the web you don't do that because it is confusing to really support it. And so you can start to build the way your apps work differently to web because you have additional capabilities. You can, horizontal scrolls are much easier to do on Android and iOS than they are on the web.
Yep. Nice. Next question is back to our favorite icon that we were talking about, the icon button. And let's say you have that scenario where you've got a few different implementations. Are you looking at creating multiple components for the same endpoint? We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's say you've got the same icon using a drop-down menu and other components. Is that two separate components? Is it the same component? Or is it just annotated differently?
Yeah, it's all going to depend on like how big your system is and what your system does in your product. I often like to, if you have standardized icons in your system, it's really great to annotate those. Here's what the error icon looks like. Here's what the warning icon looks like. And it's always called error, always called warning, right? And so you have those standards. When it comes in a menu, it may be very specific to that component. And so having, again, just examples of what the accessible name could be makes sense as we don't want too many components in our system, and having a system that's flexible is really important so people actually use your system. easy thing to do in accessibility is constrict your system because you want everything to be accessible. But then people just don't use your system, and you end up with more inaccessible stuff than if they just use the system in the first place.
Yeah. I think if your behavior is different across those different instances, that to me sounds like a different component, because you can't fudge one thing into another pattern effectively. Okay. How do you think AI and Gen AI will impact accessibility agency of both designers and developers?
Tough question. I think I think it's really important in terms of helping a designer or an engineer understand what your system is capable of. I think it's going to be great from an AI standpoint of helping you digest documentation and advising you on you should probably think about this design decision, or it'd be great if you add this annotation for AI engineer because it's going to be different in your context. I think Gen AI in terms of rendering a page based on your design system components it is quite promising, as long as that is able to understand the rules you have in place from accessibility too, and it from a kind of a standpoint of it gives you more chance to think about the bigger accessibility problems. You can kind of do service design for the needs of people with disabilities. If someone is blind, are they able to, or someone is deaf, are they able to use our telephone services? Is there other ways that we can provide a service for them? And so I think there's definitely some additional agency in terms of bigger picture thinking that's often missed. We focus too much on the little details at times, and we need to sometimes step back.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is the last question. How do you recommend we write descriptive text for images? Some users use assistive technology feedback and it's too long, and others say that it's not detailed enough. How do you strike a balance?
I was actually talking to my old boss about this recently. One thing that I learned new, so I learn things all the time, is a lot of people who are born blind often prefer shorter descriptions, because things like describing the colors aren't really so important to them. They want shorter things. But people who have lost their vision later in life can still picture what blue is and have kind of references that they can use. And they really like that long descriptions because they really want to have that full context. And so I think somewhere in the middle is only the best way. And if someone says it's too short or too long, just do your best. It's the best I can say. And what I would love to see one day is on the web and the iOS and Android and stuff is we have an option for people who use screen readers to say, I want short stuff, I want long stuff. And I think AI may help with that, allowing kind of amalgamation of alt text that already exists. We'll see how that goes. So just do your best is all I can say there for now.
Presumably it's also contextual is the context is how you could also answer that question. If it's a massive page of 2,000 products, you don't want to have to read every single description of every image, and maybe want the concise. But if it's a tighter page, maybe the longer description makes sense. All right, I think we're at time. We have hit the hour. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, everybody, for all your great questions. And I'm sure Daniel's happy to take more at a later time. This has been really fun. Thank you so much.
Everyone.